Hi there, my name is Memo, this is my channel Houseplantygoodness, and essentially it's a place where I like to geek out about my big passion. So root rot. Root rot might be something that you're hearing about a lot around the internet. If you've been in the hobby for long enough, you probably already know kind of what root rot might be, how to maybe treat it, but maybe if you're just starting off, or if you just want to see what my kind of views are on it, stick around and let's dive into what puts a lot of fear into people's kind of minds as soon as they think their plant might have root rot. So I've got my trusty iPad and I want to go through the sections that I want to talk about in this video. And as always, I will link them down below. So if you want to skip to a specific topic, you can. One of the first things I want to dive into is what actually is root rot. Then I want to move on to how you can spot root rot. What does it look like? Then I'll move on to my suggestions for first steps and then treatment of the root rot. And finally, I'll talk about how you can start rehabbing your plants, or at least how I've been doing it in my collection after they've had something like root rot. And obviously, as always, I will finish off with some final thoughts. But yeah, without further ado, let's go into the first topic. So what is root rot? And in the most simple terms, root rot is what happens when a plant's got a lot of moisture around the roots for a very prolonged period of time. So essentially you've maybe overwatered, and we can unpick what that might mean. And by overwatering, it might mean that your plant was still quite wet and you watered it again, and you've done that for a couple of times. It doesn't happen instantly, not with most plants, but some of them can be more forgiving than others, and that's something that you need to remember. The same thing goes for your conditions, your soil or your growing media, and everything else that kind of, and the pots as well. So a terracotta pot or a net pot would be more forgiving than a plastic pot, which will keep all of that moisture in. So there's all of these things that you need to remember. But if there's essentially prolonged moisture or water around some of these roots, what it tends to do is it will suffocate the roots. Something that a lot of people don't realize is that roots need to breathe, and it's not just with aroid plants. It also is with a lot of plants that you might have in your garden media, you might have in your garden, and that kind of links into, if you've got a garden, one of the things that, and this is a much deeper topic about kind of soil ecology and how much you want to disturb the soil, but for years people would say you need to turn the soil before you put plants in. The reason why you're doing this is you're creating air pockets and you're kind of breaking up that structure of a very densely packed soil because, say it with me, roots need oxygen. So if you'd imagine something like in a house plant and you've got it in a pot and there's constantly moisture around it, it is suffocating those roots. And what you might then start seeing is those roots start to die back. This can then lead to bacteria being attracted to those roots as they're dying back. And that is what starts causing the rot, or the root rot, essentially. So it's a whole storm of things that need to happen. It's like the perfect storm. Everything needs to kind of happen for it to get to that level. Now, the thing that you need to remember with this is those bacteria that are growing on those rotting roots tend to be anaerobic. And by that, and again, remember where they are. They're in a very densely packed situation of kind of moisture around the roots, and the roots have died because there isn't oxygen, which means that these bacteria survive best in areas where there is very little or no oxygen. So that is their preferred kind of growing conditions, really. It's the same things that if you put a human somewhere where there's no air, we would die quite quickly. We need air. So same thing with this bacteria. Anaerobic bacteria do better when there is no air. The other thing as well to remember is that sometimes you can have zones, and something that not a lot of people talk about, and you might get this if you ever unroot a garden plant or even one in your care. I don't know if you've ever noticed that sometimes what you might get is that some roots are going through root rot, and a lot of plants can survive with some of their roots going through root rot, and eventually they will strengthen up because they've got other roots that have not got rot on them yet. and they can bounce back. You're not constantly checking on your plant's root all the time. You're not sitting there going to every single one of your plants and unrooting it and looking at the roots every single day. It's probably months between when you've maybe looked at your plant roots, especially if there's not been any cause for it, like a repot or concern of a root rot. So this is part of the natural thing that will happen a lot of the time to the plant. It's just the problem is sometimes when you do get the root rot, depending on how aggressive it is and depending on that growing media situation, whether it's soil or anything else, how quickly that rot can move up into the main plant, if it goes all the way through to the main plant, or any of the kind of neighboring roots as well. So that's the thing that you always need to balance out a bit. So what does root rot look like? And I'll talk about first what it might look like on the outside of the plant, and then we'll go into what they might look like when you unpot the plant so you can see the roots. So one of the first indicators is you might get a plant that is starting to wilt. And this is an interesting one because some plants are very expressive and they will show you that they need watering, not that they've got root rot. So for instance, and again, this is where you might do some research into that specific plant. So one that comes to mind straight away is the Spathiphyllum, essentially. So having awareness of your plants, so that one will, and Phottonias is another one. So Phottonias will basically look like they've just died. They've just looked like they've just been overwatered and they're very floppy, and then you water them and they perk up within the next 24 hours. So those plants, it can be a bit tricky if they've got root rot. That might not be a sign that you need to be looking out for. But for a lot of plants that don't do that, if your plant starts kind of folding in on itself, that might be cause for concern. It might also be a bit too late for that plant because you do need to check, and we'll talk about this in a later section, you do need to check whether or not that root has gone all the way through to the stems and the petioles, and the outlook might not be good at that point. But I think, and I've got leaves because it's kind of autumn winter time and you will lose some of the older leaves. So if you start seeing yellowing on the leaves, and I will kind of add a bit to this as well, what you will get a lot of times with most plants is the very lowest leaves, so the oldest leaves on the plant, will be the ones that the plants will sacrifice first. Not only if they've got root rot, so it might be mineral deficiency, it might be underwatering, it might be overwatering, not root rot, but it will sacrifice those leaves first. So if you're seeing one or two leaves and it's not kind of uncommon for your plant to do that, that's probably not a cause for concern. If you're starting to get leaves much higher up, so some of the newer leaves on the plant that are going yellow and they're dying off, sometimes you might get them looking a bit kind of a wet yellow. I don't know how else to describe it. They kind of look like they've maybe been boiled in water. It's really difficult to describe, but that might be an indicator of root rot because it's not meant to be sacrificing the newest leaves. So that might be another thing that you might want to have a look at. Obviously, the big indicator, and people have always come for me for going for soil moisture meters. And yeah, they're not always 100% accurate, but they do help a lot because, especially if you're just learning, and if you take a couple of readings in the soil and it's showing that it is fully wet, and it's still like that a couple of days later, and you think that that might have been the case for quite a few days now, that's usually not a good sign. Even in the winter, your plant still should be using some water. It should be drying out its growing media probably slower than it would be in the summer, but that is something that you would kind of need to be looking out for. Now moving on to what it might look like when you're taking the plant with the soil out of its pot. And people are always concerned about disturbing the roots. The tricky thing with this is if you've got real concerns that it might be root rot, you're not doing it any favors by not checking. So the best thing I can say in terms of the least amount of disruption to the roots, if it doesn't have root rot, because you don't want to have your plant throw a bit of a hissy fit, is take the pot, remove the plant and the soil ball out of it. And let me see if I can get one that I might be able to show you. It does help when I'm a bit lazy and I don't get rid of plants that have died off. This plant died off about a year and a half ago and I still need to get rid of it, but the soil is kind of compacted. And let me see, imagine this was an actual plant, I would pull it off and you could see the roots all around it and it's still keeping its shape. That's an easy way of doing it without disturbing it. Obviously, it's a bit redundant with this is dead, but you know what I mean? You'd lift it up, you'd kind of keep it like that, and then just have a visual inspection around. Now, that's not always going to be 100% accurate because what you might be seeing, and remember what we were talking about earlier on, some of the roots might have root rot, some of them might not. So the outside roots might be completely healthy and the internal ones might be the ones that are rotting off, especially if it's densely packed on the inside. The other thing that you do need to be looking at, so obviously if you see that it does have root rot, the roots will look quite black. They'll be mushy if you touch them. Most roots, even finer roots, tend to have some elasticity to them or some bounce to them. If this is something that you touch and it kind of almost collapses into mush, that's a good indicator that it might be root rot. The other thing, this is a way to figure it out. So I know this might not be for everybody, but get your face close to it and try smelling. Rot smells bad. So you should be able to, if you're growing in soil, soil has a scent, but rot is different. You should be able to tell the difference even by just smelling it, even if you don't think you know what the difference might be. It will be quite obvious, if that makes sense. But yeah, those are the kind of indicators, both on the outside of the plant, which will kind of trigger you to go, oh, I need to maybe check the roots. And then on the inside of the roots. And then obviously if it doesn't have root rot, just pop it back into its pot without disturbing it. If you are starting to think that it does have root rot, then you would move on to the bits that I'm going to talk about in the next section. So what are the first steps and treatment for root rot? Obviously the first steps would be what I was talking about just a second ago, which is that visual assessment, making sure that what you do have is root rot. Probably or definitely you need to kind of know that it is what you think it is and it isn't something else. So you've checked the roots, you've seen that there is distress on the plant on the outside. All of these things would then lead you to the next step. So the first thing you want to do is get as much of, and this might sound a bit brutal because if your plant is in distress because it's getting root rot, taking it and unpotting all of its growing media out will stress it. There is no two ways around it. But at the same time, it's a bit of a balancing act. If you're 100% sure that you've got root rot and you let that in there because you don't want to disturb the roots, because you don't want to shock the plants, a bit of a spoiler here, it's already in shock because it is in a root rot situation. So you want to do as little damage as you possibly can. And by this, I mean taking off all of the growing media, because you will lose some of the other roots that might be healthy and all these things, but you need to get that rot off. And by that, I mean taking it off. What I would suggest is a clean pair of scissors. You want to spray it down with something like rubbing alcohol, because essentially you want to make sure that it's as sterile as possible. Obviously do this as far away from other plants as you can. Usually most people will do it around a sink if they have one. And just cut off all of the rotting, mushy, black, smelly roots. The one tip that a lot of people have already mentioned in multiple videos and online you will see is you need to cut a bit higher than where the rot is. So let me show you on a stick. I don't know how else to maybe show this, but this is probably going to be the clearest way that I can see it. Hopefully on the video you're seeing a difference between the the stick that doesn't have any remaining soil on it and the janky support stick at the top. So this is green and this is a different color down below. Assume that this is the root and this is all the bit that's got root rot. You wouldn't want to cut here, which is exactly where those two colors change. You want to cut higher and you want to give it quite a bit higher. And you cut there because what sometimes you might not be able to see is this is visible rot. There is also rot that might be happening on the inside of what looks like a healthy root. So when you cut it here, the other thing that I would say is look at the root that you've just cut and see, is there a black dot on the inside, which might mean that that rot is going up that root. You're then going to have to cut even higher until you can no longer see rot going up that root, because sometimes you might get something that the visible rot is here, but the invisible internal rot might be all the way up here. And that's the other thing that you need to remember as well, is that sometimes you might end up losing the entire root. At that point, you also want to be checking if that rot is not going through the stem of the plant. Obviously, the more you find rot, the more dire the situation might be. So after you've cut and removed all of that rotting material, there is, and this is the thing that a lot of people do already know how to do, and they do this and they get very excited, and don't get me wrong, I like a good bit of science, me, and if I can pretend to be a mad chemist at any opportunity, I will. And I talk about what a lot of people might do, which is kind of use hydrogen peroxide on the kind of root rotted area to kill off that bacteria that is causing the root rot. And I'll come back to what I was talking at the beginning of the video. This bacteria is anaerobic. Guess what hydrogen peroxide does? It kind of actively just adds a whole bunch. That's why it bubbles and fizzes. It adds an awful lot of oxygen, which kills off that bacteria. Now, for the people that don't want to do this or can't afford to do this, because this doesn't always come cheaply, at least in the UK, for some reason, I don't think hydrogen peroxide is particularly cheap over here. I think in the US, when I'm seeing a lot of people do this, I'm assuming it's cheaper for everybody there, because it really isn't that cheap here. I mean, obviously I'm using this as an example, but a fan. If you don't have hydrogen peroxide, cut it, let it air dry. You don't even need the fan, you can just let it air dry. What I would say at that point is you want to move it, and this kind of goes counterintuitive as to what most people know about their houseplants, is you want to go somewhere, if you're going to let it dry out naturally in the air, somewhere that has low humidity. You want to have that air as dry as possible. But essentially what you're doing is just exposing that area to oxygen. It's just not happening in such a vigorous visual way that you're getting with the hydrogen peroxide. So save yourself some money. Either put it in front of a fan and it will happen a bit faster. If you're doing it in front of a fan, just check in on it every like 10, 20, 30 minutes, just to make sure that the rest of the roots aren't drying out entirely and desiccating. If you do it more in the natural environment, it will take a bit longer, but you'll probably get to it before the roots, the rest of the healthy roots, start kind of crisping up a bit, because that might cause its own set of problems as well. But yeah, that is a cheaper, I want to say easier. Yeah, it's less faff. You just let it air dry. And it does the same thing. You're exposing this anaerobic bacteria to oxygen, which kills it off. And if you can, and depending on the plant, and if they've got really big, chunky roots, I'm thinking like a Monstera deliciosa, and it's got a decent stem and it's got moisture already in a lot of these areas of the plant, you could probably let it sit there for 2 or 3 hours. No problem whatsoever, probably even longer actually. And just make sure that that is all kind of dried up as well. And if you've missed any other rots on some of the other healthy looking roots, that would deal with it as well, because that's the other thing as well. You don't always necessarily see that. So letting it dry out like that, yes, your plants might look a bit wrinkly after leaving them there for a few hours or even overnight, but at least you've made sure that the rot has been killed off. And this is the thing that a lot of people, and me included, have always said. It's a lot easier to bring a plant back to life from underwatering, not extreme underwatering, than overwatering and rot, basically. So again, if you're kind of letting it dry out, it should relatively bounce back. You're not going to leave that plant that you've done all this treatment to there for 4 days without any water and without any soil. Yes, that will probably kill off the plant, but a few hours should be fine. The other thing that cannot stress enough, and this is something that might hit a few people a bit hard, whatever it was growing in, leca, pon, which can be quite expensive, even the stuff that you've made yourself, aroid mix, any kind of growing media that it was growing in, for me, throw it. Never reuse that media that has had rot anywhere near it. Yes, I know with leca and with pon, you could potentially sterilize it, but depending, if it's not a huge amount and you can afford to not reuse that material, and I know not everybody can, throw it away. I mean, with soil or any kind of aroid mix, just get rid of it. Trying to put that into other plants that might be healthy and you might be repotting and all these things can be tricky. Yes, you could try it. There's a lot of things, but for me, the risk isn't worth it. For a small amount of growing media, just get rid of it and replace it with fresh growing media when you're going to replace it, essentially. Moving on to rehabbing the plant. And there are certain things that could be done here. So depending on how large the plant is, and if it doesn't have an awful lot of distress showing on some of the top leaves or areas of the plant, what you might then want to do is take some cuttings and propagate it. So at least you've got some backups. And this kind of leads quite nicely into, if you have got a plant that you really, really love, root rot could happen to any plant parent. It doesn't matter how long we've been doing this. People were very surprised by one of the recent videos that I had when I was talking about some of the plants that are no longer in my collection, going, oh, it's really encouraging if you can kill off plants and we don't feel so bad. We all kill plants. Talk to botanists, even people that might be in the queue. We have all killed our fair share of plants, even when we think we're doing everything right. Do not be hard on yourself. And that's what I'm saying. Any plant has got the potential to get root rot. Regardless of your conditions and regardless of your care, do not beat yourself up about it. However, you can be smart about it and take what a lot of people call insurance cuttings. So when the plant is still healthy, take a couple of cuttings of propagated, especially if it's a plant that you really, really love and it's difficult to come by, all of these things. I've actually had an amazing follower who did something really smart that I never thought of myself. She sent me a plant of hers that was a rooted propagate because she wanted an insurance plant that was entirely separate to her location. So it's like I am caring for her insurance plants. I mean, obviously I get the plant and enjoy it as much as anything else, and it theoretically is my plant. But she was saying it's just that if mine ever dies off, I might need a cutting from that plant, or I might get that plant back from you and you can take a cutting from it. And I'm fine with it because it's a plant that I really wanted in my collection at that point. So that's a really cool way of also reaching out and making friends. It's like having money in the bank. Savings, that's how it works. But yeah, take cuttings even on the plant that you've got root rot on, because the other thing you need to remember is, let me give you a very specific example. If you've got a massive, massive large plant and more than half of its roots have rotted. Here's a bit of a spoiler. One of the reasons why it's sacrificing some of those leaves and they're all going yellow is because there's not enough roots to support as much of like the green part of the plant up above is. So actually taking those cuttings, you're doing that mother plant, at that point it will become a mother plant, some favors, because, and this kind of links back onto how you would propagate. Generally, you would leave 1 or 2 leaves on a cutting, because if you leave more leaves, it's going to struggle without any roots to essentially make those leaves survive and root at the same time. So you want to minimize the amount of leaves. It's the same theory. If you've lost half of your roots, in an ideal world, you should lose half of your leaves to give it kind of enough of a chance to bounce back. And this is always the really kind of heart-wrenching thing. And I've spoken to so many of you, usually on my Instagram, it's usually people panicking going, and it's almost like the 5 stages of denial. I don't have root rot. Oh, maybe I do have root rot. Oh no, I've got root rot. And it's, everybody needs to go through their emotions in their own kind of way, but it's so saddening to see. But that's why I cannot stress enough. Do not beat yourself up again about it. Learn and move from it, basically. So take a cutting, propagate it, and then what you want to do is essentially treat that remaining plant that had the root rot on it as a propagate, really. What I like to do is, after it's dried out and things like that, especially if it's dried out a bit too much, I might put it in water. So as if I was water propagating it, and leave it there for 24 to 48 hours, just so it can plump up and get all those roots in. The roots can start getting some moisture back in them. At that point, the reason why I like it in water, and it can be risky, I'm not going to lie, is because you can kind of see what's happening with the roots, and if the rot is coming back, it's very clear, and you can kind of easily deal with it rather than potting it back up to soil and then unpotting it. just a lot more visual. The one thing I will say about doing it in water is, at a minimum, I will change that water daily, just to make sure that if there's anything in that water, I am changing it out and getting new fresh water in there. And then I'll move it into its own growing media again after it's kind of reconstituted for those 24 to 48 hours. Now, this is the slightly tricky thing as well. Depending on how much dieback of the roots you've had, you might just have a propagate at that point, and you would just propagate it the same way. So whether it be pon, it'd be damp sphagnum moss, perlite, all these things. That's how you would kind of get it back into health. So just be aware of what stage and what you need to do at that point to rehab that plant back into this kind of healthier state. The other thing that I will mention is that this period when you're rehabbing the plant, and this is something that even myself have done at some point, and I've seen from other people as well, and you think you are doing the right thing, try to hold off on fertilizing, any other amendments. At that point, your plant needs to just get basic care. So light, water, whatever growing media it's in, until you've seen it properly bouncing back. It might be a couple of months before you start doing it, because can you imagine if it's struggling and then you also give it nutrients, and maybe you're giving it too much nutrients because you can't control it at that point, and it also starts getting other issues. You don't want to agitate situations, so just keep it simple. Now, the other part of the rehabbing, obviously I've talked about kind of holding back on the fertilizer and the amendments. The next part for me is a bit more of a reflection. So have a think. Where was the plant? What was the conditions that it was in? Light levels, humidity levels, temperature as well. What was your watering schedule? And this is why I hate the term schedule, because a plant will not always need to be watered 7 days a week. That will change basically. But take all these things into consideration. If it's got too much humidity and the soil is too damp, and maybe the pot is a plastic pot, it's not drying out fast enough. Maybe it's not getting enough light, so it's not utilizing the water fast enough, and it creates a boggy situation that could lead to rot. Start thinking about these things, because the sooner you start doing this, you'll kind of realize, oh, even with my best intentions, I think maybe I messed up a bit here because it probably needed a bit more light, or it was maybe getting way too much humidity there and it never really let the soil dry out, or it was too cold and I was still watering it the same way that I would have been doing it in the summer, and it's not using up that water. You will quite quickly come up with, oh, that was probably what it was, and learn from it. And when you're kind of, after you've rehabbed it, move it to a different location, change that one thing that you think might be causing it, and move from there basically. So coming into final thoughts with this one, and it is, as I said, a heartbreaking kind of topic, and I've been avoiding talking about it for so long because I know this isn't a pleasant experience for anybody, especially if you're just starting off in the hobby, especially if this is happening to a very expensive plant that you've just bought. A lot of people, this will happen with the Alba Monstera, and I'm pointing to mine, and it sounds bad, but it's kind of a bit of, it sounds horrible, it's like a baptism of fire. It's usually one of the slightly rarer, I don't know if it's that difficult to come by anymore, plant that most people will kind of transition into first before they start going crazy with aroids and very difficult plants to kind of keep happy. But ironically enough, the Monstera alba and even the Thai constellation have a propensity towards root rot. So you kind of earn your stripes. It sounds horrible. You earn your stripes because you're going to have to deal with that at that point. You're probably not prepared for it at that point, but it's good. You kind of learn early on. But as I always said, do not beat yourself up about it. It happens to all of us. Just learn from it and try to change it. And yeah, and hopefully you'll see it happen less and less. You will never get rid of it entirely, trust me. But yeah, I think that's everything I wanted to cover on this. I think essentially takeaway is don't beat yourself up. Change, progress, move on. That's fine. But I am sure a lot of people have a lot of opinions about this video. So do let me know if you think I'm talking rubbish about any of these things down below. If you've got your own suggestions, tell me why you think I'm talking rubbish and give me examples, please, rather than somebody just saying, "You're talking rubbish." Give me reasons. I am more than happy to learn as well, but yeah, be constructive. But yeah, these are what the things that I would do and the things that I look at when I'm looking at kind of root rot. It's a very in-depth topic. I could probably talk about this for an hour or two. I won't bore you with that. But yeah, hopefully you've enjoyed. Hopefully I shall see you here soon. And I truly, truly hope that you have a great rest of your day. Thanks. Bye.